I'd love to know who has a question they want to ask the panel. Maybe you've come as someone who's sceptical about campaigning and you want to push back on what you've heard. Maybe you've come as someone who's tired having been involved in campaigning from a long time and want to be encouraging. What are the questions that we have out there? If people have questions, I'd love it if you could put your hand up nice and straight, and Claire will bring the microphone to you. Let's take a couple at a time, just to speed things through so we get through as many as possible.
Hi, I just would like to say that it was my privilege to interview you, Suzanne, in a professional capacity as an independent filmmaker for Christian Aid in 2007 about the tax campaign in Lusaka, and it's lovely to see you today. We made a film about Copperbelt and about what Chinese companies were doing there, and what the tax campaign was about getting them to pay more tax to the Zambian government. It was a really very inspirational time for me then. But I've just been listening to Paul Brannan, and he's been telling us that the British attitudes to poverty is about charity, it's about raising money and targeting it, and not about justice. So my question now is, what can be done to change the mainstream British attitudes away from a charity mindset and a fundraising mindset and move it into a justice mindset where campaigning for changes in tax, for example, becomes the main policy. 6 months ago, I would have said that was an ongoing communications problem, and then I watched Invisible Children, the Coney campaign, Coney 2012 campaign, introduced millions of people to a subject they were completely unaware of before. It is entirely possible to make that step change. So I'd like to ask the panel, really, how do we get people into a justice mindset and to stop thinking about charity and live aid and just raising money, and that's the only way to tackle poverty?
Great, thank you. And there was another question over here, which let's take that. Let's take them both at the same time, and then we'll come to the panel.
A few winters ago, I remember being in Hyde Park protesting against the G20, and I agree with one of the panelists. Well, I was very impressed by the number of organisations, many Christians, many trade unionists who were campaigning for global justice, and I came away thinking, yes, but the problem is we're not organised. And I pick up on Douglas Alexander's point that the debates need to happen in the marketplace. I think the debates also need to be coming from the politicians, and we need to have clear messages from our elected governments and our structural system that they are against multinational corporations exploiting the resources of the world and the money systems in many countries, leading to, as you've said, much poverty and environmental degradation.
Great, so there's a couple of questions there. I wonder, Suzanne, if we could you could think and talk a little bit about how we need to understand that concept of justice and move away from charity. And I wonder, Douglas, if you could perhaps reflect a little bit, there's this question about how we organise and what does being organised look like, and maybe your reflections on where you've seen that done well and maybe where we can get better. And I don't know, Giles, want to reflect anything about the church's role in talking about justice rather than charity and moving that paradigm. Let's start with Suzanne.
Thank you so much for your questions. First of all, I want to say that there's also a debate in my country, for instance, whether the aid that we have received for many years, 50 years aid, has really helped us in our quest for prosperity in our nations. And I think the answer that comes back is that, in fact, perhaps aid has compounded on our situation rather than helped us. And already, of course, many of you will know that to the tune of $160 billion is siphoned, for lack of a better word, from the developing countries to the West, which means that this is about 1.5 times the aid that comes to our countries. So I may suggest that perhaps we need to treat each other as equals. The example I will give is the agreements that the nations from Africa are being forced to sign. One example is the so-called fair trade. There's no fair trade in those agreements that are, brought on this economic scene by the World Trade Organization. And also we have what they call economic partnership agreements that they're trying to impose on the African continent. If we were given an opportunity to sit on the table and make our own decisions on those issues, I think it will help. I want to agree with you that if we all work together and ensure that the multinationals pay the tax that they're supposed to pay to our countries, that will work well for all of us, because then you will not need to give us as much aid as you're doing now, because we'll be able to stand on our own 2 feet and take care of our own situations. So basically that's what the matter is all about, because aid has proven that we are in deeper trouble than we are not. And therefore we would like us to look now a different direction, from charity to justice. And how can that be done? It can be done by getting to a round table and making sure that there's fair trade in real terms, and that the decisions that are made work for all of us and not just a certain part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. And Giles, on that point about what the church's role in moving the conversation perhaps and talking about charity to justice, any reflections on that? Obviously we've been doing charity for a long time, but what does justice look like?
Justice is fundamentally about recognising our interconnectedness with each other. It seems to me that's the difference between charity and justice. It's recognising, when Desmond Tutu rightly talks about Ubuntu and I am because you are, that I am bound up in you and you are bound up in me all around the world. And so it's not, as it were, out of the goodness of my heart. We are all one, we are all linked together in something very fundamental, and Christians believe that. And so we need to have a sense of the common good that cuts so against our culture of individualism, that it's all about me first and begins with me. I mean, I think part of the thing that moving from charity to justice, I mean, and I think it's a very difficult thing to do. And I think it's a very difficult thing to do because I think we're locked into, especially in the West, into a very individualistic mindset, where it's actually, even community is simply an aggregate of individuals. And so there is a long way to go to realise that actually the problems that you're talking about are my problems, they're our problems. It's all about all of us together. And it's not just about me being kinder or nicer or a better person. There's something much more fundamental, I think, that's wrong. So I think there's a long way to go before we can really address these things in a way that's other than rhetorical. And I think part of the job of the church, is to shock people into realising that they don't care as much as they think they'd like to. That fantastic preacher Tony Campolo, the beginning of the sermon, best sermon, I think it's got the best start of any sermon ever I've ever heard. When Tony Campolo goes, I want to say 3 things to you tonight. The first one is 30,000 people died this week of preventable diseases in Africa. The second thing I want to say to you is that you don't give a shit. And the third thing I want to say to you is the thing that you remember most about this sermon is that I just said the word shit. And that's shocking on a whole load of different levels, and he's quite right to say this. I think part of the role of the church is to make us face our own complicity in things that we don't want to think that we've faced. And I think that's actually hard stuff, because the church won't be thanked for that. So I don't want to make you feel better about it. I think charity makes people want to feel better about themselves. And I think that's the thing. I think justice and facing that goes deep. It's about how we owe our humanity to each other. And if you owe your humanity to each other, then I'm not being nice. I'm not being nice by worrying about all this sort of stuff. It's fundamental to who we are. And that was my other question about the fact when you're organising that. Any reflections on there? How much is it the role of
politicians to lead? Or actually, how much is it the role of the church to lead those conversations?
Let me just add a word to Giles. I agree with Giles in terms of I am because you are, but there's also another aspect to the difference between charity and justice. Justice involves a fundamentally different power relationship, and the church is not always comfortable with acknowledging the reality of relationships of power. And in that sense, why I struggle with a language of charity in terms of poverty or development is because ultimately the only way that we will see a country like Zambia be given a fair kick of the ball is not by charity, but by fundamentally shifting the relationships of power, not just in relation to tax, but in relation to trade, in relation to climate, across a whole range. Now that takes you to what ultimately is politics about. And I would argue that politics is about finding shared solutions to shared problems. But as a campaigning organisation, I know that it is an incredibly difficult challenge to find the kind of moral urgency and clarity around some relationships of power that you can by an immediate appeal to self-gratification when you give some money and help this poor starving child. And in that sense, that's why I try and hold in my mind two different quotes from Martin Luther King. On one hand, he talks about the fierce urgency of now and says in the grand sweep of human history there is such a thing as being too late. So actually we don't have the luxury of just taking a pass on these issues. But on the other hand, he says the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We're not very good at recognising simultaneously the fierce urgency of now, but also the fact that if we want to see change in relation to tax, trade, climate change, it's going to take time. And one of the measures of our commitment to our politics and a society, a global society based on justice, is the constancy with which we maintain the struggle. Because actually this is not a battle that's going to be won in a weekend at the G20 or in a year or in a decade. It is actually a life's work. And in that sense, that's not an excuse, but it is a plea that people maintain and continue that focus. In terms of how do we sustain people on that journey? One thing I learned as development secretary is strategies engage people's mind, but it's stories that engage people's hearts. Now, missionary partners have known this for decades. Putting a missionary partner in front of a congregation is worth 1,000 PowerPoint presentations, because actually that's when you confront the common humanity that Giles was talking about. You think, actually, I can understand the experience that that person is describing. So one thing I think there is great benefit of is either having people coming and giving the experience of a life lived in poverty, or actually people being able to encounter working in developing countries or seeing for themselves. Secondly, I think we need to be better at celebrating success. I think there is a kind of revolutionary miserableism that affects elements of the development community that thinks if we tell people things are really, really terrible, that will motivate people to campaign harder. And in that sense, I think a lot of people leave those kind of meetings feeling dispirited and disempowered rather than empowered and engaged. And I do think when there are changes that we can celebrate, it's important that we share that experience. So I would say stories and celebrations are part of that experience. And the final point is, which is a lesson the church learned centuries ago, the way you build a sense of community is by contribution. And in that sense, engaging more people in these struggles, I think, is fundamental to drawing people into a shared sense of endeavour.
Great, thank you. So I'm keen to see if there are others who've got questions. I have a question I think picks up on what Douglas shared. This came in from someone on Twitter today. Is how do we as Christians keep going when the struggle feels long and tiring? What does our faith tell us about how we have to keep on pursuing that? So that'd be the one I'd love all members of the panel to reflect upon. I don't know if there are other questions out there as well. We have one here.
This is part of the charity justice distinction as well. I was just wondering, who do you think should be doing the campaigning? I mean, obviously the role of politicians and charities are very important, but is there a way of encouraging the people who are affected by the issues to empower them to campaign for themselves? And from your experience, what's the best way to go about that? Thank you.
So the question was, obviously there's a role for politicians and charities in campaigning, but how do we empower the people who are being affected by these policies, these unjust policies and practices, to do it themselves? What does that look like, be it in the UK as much as overseas as well? Are there other questions, people? Quite often this side of the room, I'm really keen to have some questions from this side of the room, if there are any. Okay, we'll stick with this one then. Let's go to this gentleman here.
I liked what Douglas Alexander said about celebrating success. It seems to me that campaigners do need encouragement by good stories, and there are some good stories about. There are social enterprises, there's microfinance organisations, there's the work of fair trade, all making a big difference in the developing world. And I do think it would be good if Greenbelt could give a bit more focus, a bit more attention to some of these positive stories where things are being changed for the better. I'm not saying they're a panacea, all these things can be done well or they can be done badly, and there's a long way to go. But let's hear more of these good stories, I say. And that might include some multinational companies who are rather better than others, whose practice is setting an example that others might follow.
Okay, so we have 3 things I'd love you all to grapple with. How do we keep going when the struggle feels long? How do we make sure we're empowering those who are most affected to have a voice? And maybe in this spirit of trying to celebrate success, you can reflect upon a campaign that you have seen or been involved in that has achieved change and inspires you and motivates you to keep being involved in the work that you're doing. Giles, would you be happy to start?
How do you keep going? It's a really great question. My own reflection on that is that campaigning becomes a pattern of life, and that even when you don't fancy it, you do it because it's become a practice. It's like going to the gym. I mean, it's one of those things that you'll end up going to the gym even when you don't want to bloody go to the gym, because it's built into your life. And that's why it's quite important for these things to become a sort of continual form of practice that you... I think it's also very... I also, just on the other, I just think it's very important that we're inspired, and, you know, I quite like the idea of... I get inspired by heroes, I get inspired by people and things that I've seen and so forth. I have to say, one of my heroes is here, Nada, over there. He's going to be really embarrassed. That man over there, by the way, is a bloody hero, sitting in the back. Nada is absolutely brilliant, and if you want to talk to anybody afterwards about the politics of Bethlehem, Nada was the deputy mayor of Bekjala for a while. That's right, isn't it? And that man knows more about campaigning and standing up for what's right than I've met for a very long time. And I just thought that is the man to talk to. I have heroes, and they inspire me.
Yeah, sure. How do we keep going? I think we just keep going and not give up, because we are people of faith, and we know that some of these things we're involved in, which are not options, are not about us. They are about everybody else and the world. And therefore, is to keep the momentum going, because it's God's business, it's God's purposes. Even if we are not there when the results come, we hand over the mantle to other people to carry on that campaign. Secondly, how can we help people to do things for themselves? Let me also maybe share with you that on the African continent, this realization has come because we as a church have also been dependent on charity. And this has actually created a dependence syndrome. So we can't move because somebody has not given us the money. But now we are on a campaign called Campaign for Africa's Dignity. So we are trying to generate our own resources. We want one of these days, when I'm invited to come to a campaign like this one, I pay my own ticket. That's where we want to get. One of these days, we are generating our own income, we're doing our own investments as a church on the African continent, and we are leading by example in our campaigns for justice. And the other thing is, yes, how, are there any examples that, yes, we can do it? Yes, there is. And one important and very famous one is the Jubilee campaign, where people of faith got involved from all over the world, Africa, Asia, you name it. People got together to fight for debt cancellation for developing countries, and it was done by people of faith. So nothing is impossible with God.
Douglas, do you want to just reflect on those 3 questions?
Because my constituency is just 6 miles west of Glasgow, I spend quite a lot of time travelling up and down, and I was at a bookshop next to Glasgow Central Station recently, and I was reading one of those dreadful American self-help books, kind of how to succeed in life despite your chin. And it said, the key to motivation is motive, the why of what you do. And actually, when I reflected on that, I thought that's quite profound. And if I had a plea to the church, it would be, and to campaigners motivated by Christianity, don't just focus on the how and the what, focus on the why. Because actually that is where uniquely I think the church is qualified to be a powerful and prophetic voice in the public square. And as a practicing politician, our language and our rhetoric is drawn from the well of public discourse. And often I feel frustrated that that well has run dry when there are so few other public voices speaking up for non-material values. If I look at the community that I grew up in, it's the community I now represent. 40 or 50 years ago, the local priest, the local teacher, the local doctor, the local trade unionist might well have been revered figures in the local community. When I now go into primary schools and I ask the kids, who do you most admire? You get kind of Posh Spice, David Beckham. I mean, David Beckham's fine because at least he's a fabulous footballer. Posh Spice, go figure. But one way or another, we idolise celebrity rather than reputation. And in that sense, I think we really mourn the loss of those voices who were a constant presence in our community, reminding us that the measure of someone's worth is not the size of their wallet, but the strength of their character. And in that sense, I say this as somebody who wishes and wants the church to be a more voluble presence in our public discourse in Britain today, because as well as telling those specific stories about development, I think to have those voices informing our political debate and our public debate more generally would actually be a powerful and important thing. In terms of what else motivates people, I had the great privilege as Development Secretary of travelling and seeing the difference that aid makes. And again, I'm doing a presentation with Simon Mayo on Monday morning in Centaur, which was partly motivated by having done too many of these sessions in Greenbelt in the past, where I want to share with you some examples of why things are getting better, not things are getting worse. You know, we've made more progress in development in the last 25 years than we've made in the last 250 years. Even since 2000, since the turn of the millennium, we've got 70 million more kids in primary education across the world. That's not to deny the fact that there are still children blighted by a lack of an education. But if, like me, you'd had the privilege of seeing those kids in Kenya or Uganda or in Tanzania, you wouldn't need to be persuaded by PowerPoint presentations that the Global Campaign for Education has made a difference. It's very, very basic. They abolished user fees for primary education in Kenya on a Friday afternoon, and on a Monday morning, 1 million more kids turned up to school. So in that sense, we can affect those outcomes. And in that sense, I think one of the things we've got to be better at is not just celebrating the big successes, but actually telling those stories, which, as I say, if you had the privilege of encountering personally, would keep you going on Christian Aid sponsored walks for the rest of your life.
So I just wanted to say something else about motivation and with regard to churches, because it strikes me that the excitement that many of us often feel when we've read the Gospels and feel the ambition there to transform ourselves and to transform the world around us, which is an ambition which is, shot through with excitement, with that sort of electricity of change. It's something absolutely extraordinary that we're asked to do. And the way in which it's too easy for that excitement and energy to get dissipated and lost in our churches when we're arguing about the minutes of the last meeting at the BCC or whatever church, whatever structures that we have. And one of the things that we have to do, it seems to me, is to constantly keep open in our churches the excitement and ambition of the message that actually just keeps us really thrillingly occupied by the issues before us. And churches are really bad at narrowing down the options that are in front of us. The world is an extraordinarily big place, and as Christians we're called to recognise its size and its scale and what we have to do in it, and it's very thrilling stuff. And too often I get depressed about the way in which churches don't share the same ambition and excitement of the scriptures that they actually read.
I think we've got time for one last round of questions. So has anyone else been prompted by what they've heard, have examples they want to share? Let's get a few more questions. We've got one here, and we'll come back to one. Any more from that side of the room while Claire is over there?
Thank you, yes. I'd be interested to hear the panel's views on the ways that we can make connections between local issues that we face even in the rich world and issues that are facing the majority world. For example, where I live in Northern Ireland, we're now threatened with shale gas extraction, fracking, which, you know, it's a different scale and there are different problems than those which face communities who are exploited by multinationals, but it's the same kind of issues, and I'm wondering whether there are more ways that we can make links and that would help people to see that these are justice issues, not charity ones.
Thank you. We've got a question here, and then anyone else want to ask a question? It's your last opportunity.
Yeah, my experience is that it's very easy to get people to be concerned and make sympathetic noises about the symptoms of what's wrong with the system, but it is a hell of a lot more difficult to get them interested in the mechanics of how the system delivers the rotten consequences that it does. And it seems to me until you understand the mechanics of how it does it, it's very difficult to prescribe what the remedies ought to be. And that goes back to the question about politicians leading, because there are politicians who do understand the mechanics of how it works, but they tend to talk to the heart rather than the head. And so you've still got huge numbers of people who don't really understand how the economy is delivering the rotten results.
Thank you. And there's a final question over here. Sorry, Claire, to make you run right across.
Multinationals tend to get a very bad press, particularly in a conversation like this. And it's very easy to generalise. Many people, I suspect, at Greenbelt are actually employed by multinationals or have got members of their family in multinationals. I'd just be very interested to know what the panel feel about the role of multinationals in terms of development, maybe through their own experience. You talked a bit about government, but clearly they could do a lot more. But are there good examples that we can think of, and are there points at which we really want to come in and say this is not good enough? Sorry.
Thank you. So we've got 3 questions. I think we'll start from Douglas and move back towards Giles. One about how we make connections between the local and the international, how we better harness that. We've got a question there about how we talk about this systemic change that we need and move from getting people to nod their heads in agreement to actually acting on it. And I guess that final one talks a little bit about how we need to understand how our Monday to Fridays should be influenced by our Sundays. You know, how our faith should inspire what we do in our work as well, and what does that look like in terms of pursuing a more just and equitable world.
Let me start with this gentleman's question. I couldn't agree more. I think the only category of people who do worse than multinationals in conversations like this is probably politicians. So I speak from the heart. One of the last things that I was involved in my constituency on Wednesday afternoon was a jobs fair for young people. We've been working with local colleges, local organisations to try and provide opportunities in a community where those unemployed for more than 6 months under the age of 25 has gone up by 1,000% in the last 12 months, and where there are 13 people chasing every vacancy in the local job market. So if you say to me, do I want more businesses in Paisley or do I want less? I want more businesses. And in that sense, I just think to ascribe all wrong or all evil to multinationals and not recognise that actually, of course, companies and corporations have responsibility, but we all have responsibilities as well, is to see the world through one part of the kaleidoscope. It seems to me part of the challenge for politicians and for our public life is to ensure that as individuals, whether as taxpayers or as citizens, and companies, multinational or domestic, is to help them be good and to stop them being bad. And in that sense, it's too easy, and in some ways it's a get out of jail card for people to somehow externalise all wrong to somebody else. If only the multinationals did this, if only the politicians did that, if only the public would understand. You know, I have to deal with the fact that Fred Goodwin, one of the most prominent bankers who helped crash the Royal Bank of Scotland, grew up in my constituency. You know, it's a difficult challenge for us to externalise the bankers when actually he grew up in Paisley. So in that sense, I think one of our challenges is for the church to recognise the capacity for error, for weakness, for wrong, but on the other hand, to be a catalyst and a stimulus to change. And I think some of the risks of the way that people talk about multinationals is actually absolves people of the responsibility that Giles mentioned at the beginning. I think one of the directives that we should take from a session like this is to try and be the change that we want to see in the world. And in that sense, when you say, what can we do on a Sunday and what can we do during the rest of the week? The fact that so many congregations run fair trade stalls and tradecraft stalls gives me hope as a practicing politician, because it is a recognition on a weekly basis what we should all recognise in our churches, which is it's fundamentally not about us, it's about the people that we're called to serve. And in that sense, I hope and believe that the churches can continue to be a vessel and a channel for those values and for those ideas in the future. And that's what I think will help sustain organisations like Tearfund and Christian Aid in the extraordinarily important work that they're still called to do.
Thank you. Suzanne, do you want to?
Can we go? Yes, there's that famous quotation from Latin American bishop, Roman Catholic, who said, "When I give to the poor, they call me a saint. And when I ask why the poor have got no money, they call me a communist." And that's absolutely right about the systemic issue. And that's probably going back to this business about charity and justice, that we have systemic issues. Now, though I do agree about it's too easy, it's too cheap to have a go at multinationals. The truth of the matter is very large companies do have an enormous amount of power. Enormous amount of power. And with that power comes a responsibility, and it's quite right for us to be critically vigilant about the power that they have. Particularly when, and we're talking about tax here, the other day I found out that the Taj Mahal restaurant on High Street, Jersey, is the registered home of 400 UK companies. It's the registered home of 400 UK companies, is the Taj Mahal in Jersey. Why is that? We all know why that is. Now, the problem with the multinational bit is that actually what our anxiety is these days, it makes it terribly easy for people to shift money around all over the world in such a way that tax is not being properly paid. And this is the anxiety that many of us have. I mean, I work for a multinational. I mean, the Anglican Church is a multinational. I mean, I understand, you know, and I understand the idea about, this is not about we can get by without trade, without goods, without, for me it's not. It's just, I just think that's a sort of nonsense. We all own shares in the way of the world, and this is how the world works. But I think there is a huge amount of critical vigilance we need on the way in which very large companies often employ teams of accountants to help them avoid paying the tax that's theirs. And what we've seen in the City of London is that the regulators are often not as sharp as the people that are moving the money around. So I don't like the cheap rhetoric. I don't like the cheap rhetoric of hostility to multinationals, but I think the suspicion is well grounded.
And Suzanne, do you just want to offer any reflections on that question about how we connect, picking up on what Giles was talking about, the tax campaign, but also how we connect what's happening in Zambia and to what's happening here as well?
Yeah, well, before I do that, I was struggling to find something good to say about multinationals from my point of view, and I think I found one. One is that they create employment, don't they? They come and invest in our countries, and so they create employment. I think that's a positive thing. But when you critically analyze, you find that what quality of jobs are those? That's a completely different discussion about multinationals. The other thing is, from where I come from, it's very difficult to determine values and principles on which these multinationals work, because all agreements are in secret. We don't know what they agree with our governments, so there's no transparency. So we don't have information to base our decisions on, and that's a problem. And this, I think they're in together with our own governments, because they sign these agreements with our governments, but our governments do not let us know the kind of agreements that these multinationals make with our governments. So there's a secrecy around these issues, and hence it's very easy, like we have heard already this afternoon, about monies being moved out of the country. For instance, the money that is generated by multinationals in my countries is not returned in my country. They take, when they export copper, for instance, the money stays here, doesn't come back to be circulated in our economy, and that is a problem for us, and many other problems such as that. On the issue of connection between local and international issues, I think we recognize that we now live in a global village. The world is becoming smaller because of the information highway, and our problems affect your problems and vice versa. That is why I was suggesting earlier that it's very important that all of us, from wherever we are, it's our responsibility to connect these issues, because they cannot be in isolation anymore. What we can do to help the West, for instance, we ought to do that, and vice versa, because we are in these struggles together.
Thank you. I think that's an apt moment to finish on, that we are in these struggles together, and that's how we have to be connected. I want to thank the three panelists who brought such passion and energy to our conversation over the last hour: Douglas Alexander, Suzanne Matale, and Giles Fraser.